In the heart of a quiet, unassuming neighborhood in Misato, Saitama, there stood a house that looked no different from the others on the street. Modest, unremarkable, an image of suburban peace and order. The kind of home where neighbors exchanged pleasantries in the morning and children played just beyond the front gate. But behind the closed doors of that house, a nightmare unlike any Japan had ever known was unfolding. What appeared to be an ordinary family home had become a house of horror, a prison where a 17-year-old girl was held captive by four boys who reveled in unspeakable cruelty. For 44 days, Junko Furuta endured an existence so brutal, so beyond comprehension, that even seasoned investigators were left shaken when the full extent of the atrocities came to light. This house belonged to the family of Nobuharu Minato, one of the key perpetrators. The other boys involved were Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader already notorious for his ties to the Yakuza, Shinji Minato, Nobuharu's brother, and Joe Ogura, another gang member with a penchant for violence. Together, these boys formed a twisted alliance bound by their shared desire for control, dominance, and cruelty. Their backgrounds were disturbingly similar. Each came from environments that should have instilled a sense of morality and decency, but instead, they gravitated toward delinquency. Miyano, with his Yakuza connections, was emboldened by a sense of untouchability. Nobuharu Minato, despite living under his parents' roof, lacked any sense of accountability. Ogura and Shinji Minato were equally entrenched in a culture of violence and rebellion. What began as an impulsive act of abduction soon spiraled into something far more sinister. The boys didn't simply intend to hold Junko captive. They sought to break her completely, body and mind. And for 44 agonizing days, they did everything in their power to achieve that goal. Throughout these 44 days, Junko Furuta was failed by everyone around her. Neighbors who ignored her cries, a family that chose fear over action, and a society that did not intervene in time. Her story is not just one of cruelty, but of systemic failure, and a stark reminder of the consequences of silence. On the outside, it looked like any other home in Misato, a quiet suburb in Saitama Prefecture, a two-story structure with modest, unremarkable features, the kind of place where neighbors waved politely in passing and evenings were spent in relative peace. No one walking past would have suspected that behind those walls, unimaginable suffering was unfolding, a nightmare hidden in plain sight. This house, belonging to the Minato family, became the epicenter of a crime so brutal it would haunt Japan for generations. For 44 agonizing days, Junko Furuta was held captive there, subjected to relentless torment by four boys who seemed devoid of any shred of humanity. The home was like countless others in the area, small, cramped by Western standards, but typical for suburban Japan. It had narrow hallways, rooms separated by thin walls, and sliding doors that offered little soundproofing. Despite this, the cries for help that echoed within those walls went ignored. Neighbors later admitted they heard screams, pleading, and strange noises late into the night. Some claimed they assumed it was merely family disputes or teenage mischief. But this was no ordinary household dispute. Junko Furuta's captors had turned the Minato home into a fortress of terror. Rooms that should have held warmth and family memories instead became chambers of suffering. The gang, led by Hiroshi Miyano, used this house as their base of operations, knowing that their threats and connections to the Yakuza would deter any intervention. The accomplices. Hiroshi Miyano was the ringleader. At just 18 years old, he had already carved out a reputation as a violent thug with ties to Japan's infamous organized crime syndicate, the Yakuza. His arrogance was fueled by a belief that he was untouchable, protected by his gang affiliations, and a justice system that had often failed to hold juvenile offenders accountable. Nobuharu Minato, whose family home served as Junko's prison, was a close associate of Miyano. His parents lived under the same roof but chose to ignore what was happening within their own walls. Some reports suggest they feared retaliation from Miyano and his gang. Joe Ogura, another accomplice, was known for his impulsive, violent behavior. Despite being only 17, his involvement in the gang made him a feared figure among his peers. Shinji Minato, Nobuharu's younger brother, completed the group. Together, these four boys formed a pact of cruelty, bound by their desire for power and control. Day 1. Junko was forced to call her parents, telling them she had run away and was staying with friends. It was a cruel manipulation designed to buy time and ensure that no one came searching for her. The first night was filled with terror and confusion. Junko likely clung to the hope that this nightmare would be temporary, that someone would notice her absence or come to her rescue. Day 5. The gang's behavior became increasingly sadistic. They began subjecting Junko to physical and psychological torment. She was left bound for hours, deprived of food, water, and basic hygiene. Day 10. Despite her weakened state, Junko attempted an escape. She managed to reach the front door, but her captors caught her before she could flee. The punishment for this act of defiance was brutal and intended to crush her remaining will to fight. Day 15. The abuse escalated as the boys invited others from their gang to join in the torment. The Minato household became a gathering place where Junko's suffering was treated as entertainment. Day 20. Her condition began deteriorating rapidly. Malnourished and weakened, Junko was forced to endure unimaginable physical pain. Yet through it all, her spirit remained defiant. Day 30. Neighbors heard Junko's cries but continued to dismiss them as typical household disturbances. Minato's parents, who lived under the same roof, made no attempt to intervene. Their silence was a complicity that allowed the horrors to continue. This was a community that chose ignorance over action, a society that failed to protect one of its most vulnerable members. Day 40. Junko's condition had become critical. Her body was barely recognizable, a testament to the cruelty inflicted upon her. But despite her captors' attempts to break her completely, a flicker of resilience remained. Her suffering was not just physical, but psychological. The boys took pleasure in stripping away her dignity, isolating her from any sense of hope or humanity. One of the most chilling aspects of this case is the role, or lack thereof, of the Minato family. Nobuharu Minato's parents lived under the same roof where Junko was being held captive. They saw her condition, heard her cries, and yet did nothing. Some reports suggest that they feared Hiroshi Miyano's connections to the Yakuza and chose self-preservation over doing the right thing. Others imply that they simply didn't care. Regardless of their motivations, their silence enabled the continued torture and abuse of Junko Furuta. They had countless opportunities to intervene, to call for help, but each time they chose to look the other way. Junko Furuta's 44 days in captivity represent a failure on every level, by the justice system, by the community, and by the very people who could have saved her. After 44 days of unimaginable horror, Junko Furuta's suffering reached a tragic and brutal end. Her captors, fueled by a twisted sense of power and control, were determined to silence her forever. As her health rapidly declined and her body bore the scars of relentless abuse, what should have been her final moments of peace and release were met with unspeakable cruelty. Junko's physical state had deteriorated to the brink of death. Her body, once vibrant and full of youthful promise, was now a shell, emaciated, bruised, and broken. The effects of prolonged starvation, dehydration, and relentless torture had left her barely able to move, let alone speak. Reports indicated that she was often left lying in pools of her own blood and waste, unable to care for herself. Her spirit, which had once been resilient despite the unimaginable pain, was fading. Yet even in her weakened state, Junko clung to life. She survived through sheer willpower, enduring what no human being should ever have to endure. But on January 4th, 1989, her tormentors delivered the final blow. On that day, Junko's captors, Hiroshi Miyano, Nobuharu Minato, Joe Ogura, and Shinji Minato, decided to subject her to one last fatal beating. The boys, already intoxicated and agitated, blamed Junko for the consequences of their crime catching up to them. The punishment was brutal beyond measure. They kicked, punched, and struck her with blunt objects, showing no mercy as her fragile body absorbed each blow. Reports describe how they poured lighter fluid over her and set parts of her body ablaze, laughing as she writhed in pain. Junko's body could endure no more. As the assault continued, her breathing became shallow and then, finally, it stopped. After 44 excruciating days, Junko Furuta was gone. Her captors, however, showed no remorse. To them, her death was just another problem to solve. In the aftermath of Junko's murder, the gang faced a grim realization. Her body needed to disappear. Panicked but calculating, they decided on a macabre solution that would both conceal their crime and rid them of any evidence. They placed Junko's lifeless body in a large drum, contorting her fragile remains to fit into the confined space. But even this gruesome act wasn't enough for them. They wanted to ensure that no trace of her could ever be found. The boys filled the drum with wet concrete, sealing Junko inside as though erasing the evidence would absolve them of their guilt. The weight of the drum, now filled with concrete and their darkest secrets, was immense. They transported it to a vacant lot in Koto, Tokyo, where it was abandoned, a silent monument to their monstrous crime. The drum remained there unnoticed until Miyano, convinced he was untouchable, began bragging about the murder. His arrogance led to his downfall. Following an unrelated arrest, police interrogated him and uncovered the horrific truth. On January 23, 1989, authorities found the drum. What they discovered inside shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The sight of Junko Furuta's encased remains was described as haunting, a stark reminder of the brutality she had endured. News of Junko's murder spread rapidly, sending shockwaves through Japan. A nation known for its peaceful streets and low crime rates struggled to comprehend how such a horrific act could have occurred unnoticed. The community, once blissfully unaware of the horrors unfolding in their midst, was now gripped by outrage and sorrow. Junko Furuta's story was far from over. Her death, though tragic, became a symbol of resilience, justice, and the consequences of indifference. After weeks of searching for Junko Furuta, the truth finally began to surface. The disappearance of a young girl, once dismissed as a runaway case, was now a murder investigation, one that would unravel a web of lies, deceit, and monstrous cruelty. The investigation into Junko's disappearance began in December 1988, after her parents reported her missing. At first, law enforcement presumed she had run away, as she had called home to tell her family that she was staying with friends. This assumption was easy to make, given that Junko's disappearance appeared to follow a pattern that many families feared: teenagers rebelling, seeking independence. But as days turned into weeks, the case began to take a darker turn. Despite initial reports suggesting Junko was simply a runaway, detectives began to notice inconsistencies. There were no signs of her reaching out to friends or family, no attempts to contact her from places she might have gone. The more they dug into her background, the clearer it became. Something was horribly wrong. The break in the case came when Hiroshi Miyano, one of the captors, was arrested for an unrelated offense. While in custody, Miyano began to boast about his involvement in a shocking crime. At first, his story was dismissed as the wild ramblings of an arrogant young criminal. But as detectives pieced together his tale, they realized that he was describing the torture and murder of Junko Furuta in chilling detail. The police knew they had to act quickly. Miyano's confession was the key to unlocking the truth behind Junko's horrific fate. But as investigators turned their attention to him, they also began to gather evidence that would lead them to the other perpetrators. Miyano's confession was just the beginning. The investigators, having uncovered the true scope of the crime, now sought to interrogate the others involved. The shocking nature of Miyano's revelations pushed the authorities into high gear. The first target was Joe Ogura, a close accomplice who had been with Miyano throughout the ordeal. Ogura, known for his impulsive and violent tendencies, was initially hesitant to confess. But as detectives placed pressure on him, reminding him of the evidence already mounting against him, he finally cracked. He admitted to his participation in the torment of Junko Furuta, describing the sadistic details of the abuse and murder. With Ogura's confession, the investigators closed in on the remaining two: Nobuharu Minato and his younger brother, Shinji Minato. The Minato brothers, whose home had served as the scene of the crime, had stayed relatively quiet during the early days of the investigation. But once they realized the weight of the confessions already obtained, they too succumbed to the pressure. Shinji, the younger brother, initially tried to distance himself from the actions of the gang, but the evidence was overwhelming. His role in Junko's capture and subsequent abuse was undeniable. He too confessed, recounting his part in the horrific ordeal. The most chilling aspect of the investigation was the involvement of Nobuharu Minato's parents. Despite living in the same house as Junko, they failed to act. When questioned, they claimed they had no knowledge of the torture taking place under their roof. Their lack of intervention, whether born out of fear or apathy, had allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. As the confessions rolled in, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The investigators had all the evidence they needed to make the arrests official. Hiroshi Miyano, Joe Ogura, Nobuharu Minato, and Shinji Minato were all taken into custody for the murder of Junko Furuta. The community, once blind to the horrors unfolding in their midst, now had to face the shocking truth. Junko's case was not just a tragic disappearance. It was a calculated and gruesome crime that had taken place in their own backyard. The arrests were only the beginning of a long and painful journey for Junko's family. While they had finally learned the truth, it would never bring Junko back. And even as the perpetrators were apprehended, the larger questions of justice and accountability remained. The confessions were the first step in seeking justice for Junko Furuta. But as the case moved toward trial, the scars of the crime were still fresh for everyone involved. The arrests of the 4 young men who had tormented Junko Furuta were merely the beginning of a lengthy, painful journey toward justice. But as the legal process unfolded, what would follow would spark public outrage across Japan and the world. The trial of Hiroshi Miyano, Joe Ogura, Nobuharu Minato, and Shinji Minato began in 1989, just months after Junko's body was discovered. The weight of their crimes, the abduction, torture, and murder of a young girl, should have guaranteed a swift and harsh legal process, yet the circumstances of the case and the involvement of juveniles would lead to a shocking outcome. At the heart of the legal proceedings was the fact that all 4 perpetrators were minors at the time of the crime. This fact alone would become the central focus of the court case and would ultimately shape the sentences they would receive. Despite the horrific nature of the crime, Japanese law at the time provided a certain level of leniency for juveniles under the age of 18. For many, this was a devastating revelation. The public could not fathom how young men, who had shown such a complete disregard for human life, could be given such lenient sentences. Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. However, the reality of his sentence was deeply controversial. His involvement in the planning and execution of Junko's murder was undeniable, but he was still classified as a juvenile at the time of the crime, which meant the court took a more lenient approach than many felt he deserved. Joe Ogura, one of the other main perpetrators, received a similarly lenient sentence. Despite the fact that he had participated in the sadistic abuse and murder of Junko, Ogura was sentenced to a relatively short term in juvenile detention, where he would serve far fewer years than anyone expected. The 2 Minato brothers, Nobuharu and Shinji, were given lighter sentences still. Shinji, who had played a significant role in the crime, was sentenced to a mere 5 years in juvenile detention. His older brother Nobuharu was sentenced to 7 years, again an incredibly light punishment in the face of such horrific crimes. As the sentences were handed down, shock rippled through the public. How could the justice system, meant to protect society, allow such perpetrators to escape without facing the full consequences of their actions? The court's decision to offer leniency to the 4 boys sent a message that many felt was deeply wrong. The crime had been monstrous, the suffering of the victim immeasurable, yet their sentences did not reflect the gravity of their actions. The verdicts ignited widespread protests across Japan. Junko's case had captured the hearts and minds of the public, and people were furious. They had watched in horror as the details of Junko's abuse were laid bare, and now they were forced to confront the reality that the system was failing her. For many, the court's leniency was an unforgivable injustice. Angry citizens took to the streets, holding protests outside courthouses and government buildings. The media, too, was quick to report on the public outrage, and news outlets began to question whether Japan's legal system was too soft on violent crimes committed by juveniles. Junko's family, already shattered by the loss of their daughter, felt betrayed once again. They had hoped that the trial would bring justice. that it would be a moment when the world would recognize the severity of what had been done to their beloved child. But the sentencing left them heartbroken and disillusioned. The public, too, expressed their disbelief through open protest and media outcry. Junko's case had become a symbol of a broken system, a system that had failed her in life and continued to fail her in death. Years passed, and the story of Junko Furuta seemed to fade from the headlines. However, for the families affected by the crime, the journey toward justice was far from over. The real shock came when, despite their heinous actions, some of the perpetrators were eventually released from prison. In 1999, just 10 years after Junko's murder, the first of the four criminals, Joe Ogura, was released on parole. His release caused an uproar, as many believed that no amount of time could ever repay the debt owed to Junko and her family. Ogura, having served a fraction of his sentence, had been allowed to walk free. But Ogura was not the only one. Hiroshi Miyano, the leader of the group, was eventually released as well. He served just over 17 years of his life sentence before being paroled. To the public, this felt like an insult. The notion that someone could commit such an unspeakable crime and be allowed to re-enter society with such a short prison sentence was incomprehensible. Nobuharu Minato was also released after serving only 10 years, and his younger brother Shinji, who had been sentenced to just 5 years, was paroled after serving a portion of that time. For many, the fact that these individuals had been allowed to reintegrate into society after such a violent crime felt like an affront to justice itself. What followed was nothing short of tragic. Some of the perpetrators, once freed, returned to a life of crime. Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader, was arrested again for robbery in the early 2000s. His criminal tendencies had never been fully curbed by his time in prison, and his eventual reoffending was a grim reminder of the failures of the justice system. The release of the perpetrators of such a horrific crime seemed to epitomize a larger issue: the failure to truly understand the weight of their actions and the long-lasting impact on the victim's family. The Furuta family was left to grapple not only with the loss of their daughter, but with the ongoing realization that the criminals responsible would never fully be held accountable for the life they stole. Even after the release of the perpetrators, the memory of Junko Furuta remains an indelible part of Japan's criminal history. Her story serves as a painful reminder of the complexities of the justice system, the failings of rehabilitation, and the unrelenting anger felt by those who seek real justice for victims like Junko. Her death, the public's outrage, and the controversial sentences have left a scar on Japanese society, one that may never fully heal. The impact of Junko Furuta's tragic story extended far beyond the courtroom, shaking not just the families directly involved, but a nation as a whole. As Japan grappled with the aftermath, her case would force an uncomfortable reckoning with the country's legal system, its societal values, and its treatment of victims of violence. In the years following Junko's brutal murder, the Japanese legal system came under intense scrutiny. Her case, along with others that had similar elements, became a catalyst for legal reforms. The public's outcry at the perceived leniency given to juvenile criminals who committed heinous acts and the failure of the justice system to deliver true justice prompted the Japanese government to reevaluate its laws regarding juveniles and violent crime. Prior to Junko's case, Japan's legal system took a more rehabilitative approach to juvenile crime, with an emphasis on reintegration into society rather than punitive measures. However, Junko's case, with its grotesque details and public outrage, showed that this system was severely flawed. Her story underscored the necessity for a legal system that could balance justice with rehabilitation, but also demand accountability for truly horrific actions, even when committed by minors. In response to the public outcry, Japan's juvenile crime laws were revisited. In 1997, a series of reforms were enacted, increasing the legal consequences for juveniles convicted of violent crimes. The legal age for adult punishment was lowered in certain cases, and the justice system made efforts to ensure that juveniles guilty of crimes as serious as murder would face appropriate consequences, regardless of their age. These changes were seen as a direct response to the Furuta case, highlighting the law's shift from focusing solely on rehabilitation to considering the gravity of the offense. While Junko's case spurred legal changes, It also sparked a wider discussion about how society views minors involved in serious crimes. The legal reforms were meant to prevent future cases of extreme violence and help ensure that perpetrators would be held accountable to the fullest extent, even if they were young. But legal reform was only one part of the legacy left by Junko Furuta. Her case would forever change the cultural landscape of Japan, becoming a defining moment in its criminal history. In a society that prides itself on harmony and respect for others, Junko's case shattered the illusion of safety that many took for granted. It became one of Japan's darkest and most painful memories, a reminder of the evil that could hide in plain sight. Her death and the brutality of the crime left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of the Japanese people. While many cases of violence are fleeting in the memory of society, Junko Furuta's story remains burned into the cultural consciousness. Her name is still invoked in discussions of justice, juvenile crime, and societal failure. In Japan, the story of Junko is still taught in schools as a cautionary tale, a grim warning about the depths of human cruelty and the importance of safeguarding the vulnerable. It serves as an ongoing reminder to never forget the victims, to not allow the horrific suffering of one person to be overshadowed by the apathy of society. Junko's case also sparked difficult but necessary conversations about the treatment of women and girls, how society often fails to protect them, and how those who inflict harm must be held accountable. Junko Furuta's story has continued to make headlines over the years, not only in Japan but internationally. The media's portrayal of the crime, with its shocking details, captured the attention of the world. News outlets, documentaries, and books have continued to cover her story, ensuring that it remains part of the global conversation about crime, justice, and the treatment of victims. Several documentaries and television specials have been produced, exploring the events of Junko's abduction, torture, and murder, keeping the story alive for newer generations. In the years following the crime, books were written, with journalists and authors attempting to piece together the horrifying details of what occurred during those 44 days of captivity. These works allowed the public to better understand the depth of the tragedy, even as the perpetrators began to fade from the public eye. However, media coverage was not without its controversy. Some outlets, in their eagerness to expose the salacious details, sensationalized the case in ways that some felt were disrespectful to Junko and her family. The line between public interest and exploitation was sometimes blurred, with discussions focusing on the horror of the crime rather than the deeper, more meaningful conversations about justice, rehabilitation, and societal responsibility. Through all the media coverage, the legal reforms, and the societal shifts that followed, one thing has remained clear. Junko Furuta has not been forgotten. Her story, tragic as it is, has become a symbol of resilience, of the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. In the years since her death, Junko's memory has been honored in various ways. Tributes have been paid by her family, by those who were touched by her story, and by people around the world who have heard of her suffering. The Furuta family, in their grief, has worked to ensure that Junko's legacy lives on, not just as a victim, but as a young girl who had so much potential, a girl who was robbed of her future, but whose memory continues to inspire. Various nonprofit organizations, victims' rights groups, and domestic violence awareness campaigns have used Junko's case to push for stronger protections for vulnerable people, particularly women and children. Her legacy continues to be one of advocacy for those who can't speak for themselves, for those who need protection from society's darker forces. Junko Furuta, though taken too soon, has become a symbol of how far we must go to fight injustice, how important it is to protect the weak, and how we must never forget the voices of the innocent who were lost. In the end, the greatest tribute to Junko Furuta is not just the changes in the law or the media coverage, but the enduring spirit of the people who refuse to let her story be forgotten. As Japan continues to move forward, Junko's name stands as a reminder of the fragility of life, the importance of empathy, and the need for society to take responsibility for the most vulnerable among us. Junko Furuta may no longer be with us, but her memory and the lessons we have learned from her suffering will remain long after the headlines fade. As we reach the end of Junko Furuta's devastating story, we are left with more than just the haunting memories of what happened to her. We are faced with difficult questions about justice, empathy, and the responsibilities of society. Could this atrocity have been prevented? What could we have done to protect a vulnerable young girl from such unimaginable cruelty? Junko's case serves as a sobering reminder of how easily cruelty can be hidden behind closed doors, and how essential it is that we stay vigilant in our communities. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems that are supposed to protect us, and to ask ourselves what we can do to prevent others from falling victim to similar horrors. No one should ever have to face what Junko did, and yet she did. How many others are there in the shadows, suffering in silence, waiting for someone to notice? We must never become complacent in the face of injustice. The question isn't just how Junko was failed by those around her, but how we, as a society, can learn from this painful chapter in history and ensure that something like this never happens again. How do we protect the most vulnerable members of society, those who are often the easiest to ignore or dismiss? The answer lies in awareness, action, and accountability. We all have a responsibility to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, to speak out when we see something wrong, and to support systems that protect the weak and the innocent. We must hold those who commit such crimes accountable, and we must work to prevent the next tragedy before it even begins. As we reflect on Junko Furuta's life and the horror she endured, let us commit ourselves to never forgetting her story. Let us use it as a catalyst for change in our own lives, in our communities, and in the wider world. Justice does not end when a trial is over. It continues through the vigilance of those who care. This case and the lessons it carries have sparked many conversations around the world. I invite you, the viewers, to join this conversation. What do you think? Could this have been prevented? How can we protect those who are vulnerable and ensure justice is done? I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's engage in a respectful discussion, listen to each other's perspectives, and, together, work toward a better future where such tragedies are never repeated. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you'll be part of a community that is committed to shedding light on the darkest corners of our world, raising awareness, and ensuring that the voices of victims are heard. Thank you for watching, and let us all continue to honor the memory of Junko Furuta and the countless others who have suffered in silence. Until next time, stay vigilant